In the span of just 72 hours, France's most ambitious military operation in West Africa was over, not with gunfire, but with complete and total defeat. Yet almost nobody outside elite government circles even knew it happened. What you're about to discover is a masterclass in geopolitical miscalculation, how one nation's desperation to hold on to colonial-era power led to a proxy war that never actually happened, and how a young military leader in Burkina Faso saw it coming from miles away. This is the story of the moment everything changed in West Africa. To understand what France was trying to do, you first need to understand what France was losing. 4 decades, really, for more than a century, France maintained an iron grip over its former colonies in West Africa. This wasn't some distant historical arrangement either. French troops were still physically stationed across the region. French currency still controlled economies. French military strategy still dictated security policies. France, in many ways, was still running the show. But by 2023, that power was evaporating faster than anyone in Paris expected. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in the Sahel with over 22 million people, had become the epicenter of this power shift. 2 military coups in rapid succession, first in January 2022, then again in September 2023, had brought Ibrahim Traoré to power. Traoré was young, ambitious, and most importantly to France's anxiety, he was nationalist. He rejected France's influence. He kicked out French troops. He turned instead toward Russia and other regional partners like Niger and Mali. To the French government, this wasn't just losing one country. This was watching the entire structure of French influence in West Africa begin to crumble like old concrete. France had a choice: accept the new reality, or fight to get back what it lost. They chose to fight. But they weren't going to do it directly. Here's where the story becomes fascinating. France couldn't openly invade or launch a large military operation against Burkina Faso. International law, global opinion, and the sheer difficulty of such an operation made it unfeasible. But they had options. They had allies. And among those allies was Chad, a military state led by Mahamat Devi, who had his own complex relationship with Burkina Faso and could be persuaded to serve French interests. The plan, pieced together from intelligence and regional analysis, was brutally simple. Use Chad's military as a proxy force to rapidly occupy Burkina Faso's northern region. The northern territories were sparsely populated, strategically important, and the French calculation was that a swift operation could establish control before Burkina Faso's military could adequately respond. Once Chad's forces held that territory, the argument would be made that they were necessary for regional stability, fighting terrorist groups, establishing security. France would provide air support, logistical backing, and the political cover that comes with being a permanent UN Security Council member. It was a calculated risk, but from Paris's perspective, it made sense. Traoré had alienated Western nations. His military wasn't as advanced or experienced as Chad's forces. Regional support seemed fragmented. What could go wrong? But that's not the full story. Not even close. What France didn't fully account for was this: Ibrahim Traoré wasn't operating in a vacuum. He wasn't some isolated leader hoping for the best. He had built something that France couldn't see until it was already too late: a network. A coalition. An alliance system that extended across borders. Most critically, Traoré had intelligence. Good intelligence. Intelligence that revealed France's plan before it was executed. Think about that for a moment. France, with all its military sophistication, all its intelligence agencies, all its global reach, and somehow, a young military leader in one of the poorest nations on earth found out what they were planning. The information moved through channels. Perhaps from sympathetic military officials. Perhaps from diplomats with divided loyalties. Perhaps from technology and surveillance that Traoré's allies had access to. The exact source remains unclear, but the result was unmistakable. Traoré knew what was coming. And unlike a panicked leader who might have called for international intervention or made public accusations, Traoré did something far more strategic. He didn't panic. He didn't publicize the threat. He prepared. Here's where it gets interesting. Traoré reached out to Niger and Mali, both nations that had also ejected French influence and both nations that shared his vision of regional sovereignty. More importantly, both nations shared a border with Burkina Faso's northern region. If Chad was going to invade from the north, those borders would become critical positions. What happened next was a quiet military coordination that would have been invisible to most observers. Troops moved. Positions were established. Preparations were made. But because nothing happened loudly or publicly, the international media barely noticed. Regional analysts noted some movement, some repositioning, but the scale and coordination of what was actually taking place remained hidden. It was the kind of preparation that only works if you know the attack is coming. Then came the day Chad's military forces began moving toward Burkina Faso's northern border. From Chad's perspective, everything should have gone according to plan. They were moving into territory with sparse population density. Intelligence from French sources suggested they would encounter minimal organized resistance. The operation was called a counter-terrorism measure, a security operation to stabilize the region, all language that had worked in similar scenarios before. What Chad's commanders found was something completely different. When their forces arrived expecting weak resistance or possibly no organized opposition at all, they instead encountered a fully prepared, coordinated military presence. And it wasn't just Burkina Faso. It was Niger. It was Mali. All three nations had quietly positioned forces at the border. They weren't there to start a war. They were there to make absolutely clear that any invasion would face united resistance. This is where the brilliance of Traoré's response becomes evident. He didn't need to fight. He didn't need to fire a shot. He simply needed to make clear that the cost of the invasion would be unacceptable. He did this not through aggression, but through intelligence, preparation, and alliance building. When Chad's military commanders assessed the situation, faced with the prospect of attacking not one country, but a three-nation military alliance on the ground, facing potential air support they couldn't match, with unclear international backing, the calculation changed in an instant. What had seemed like a clean operation became a potential disaster. A retreat wasn't a sign of weakness, it was the only rational decision. Chad's forces withdrew. No shots fired. No battles fought. No military engagements at all. The operation was over before it truly began. But here's where things get really interesting. The failure of this operation wasn't just a military embarrassment for France. It was a geopolitical watershed moment that revealed something much deeper. The old system of control was broken. For the first time in modern African history, a coalition of Sahel nations had united against external intervention, and they had done so successfully. They hadn't begged the United Nations. They hadn't called for international support. They hadn't gone to the African Union. They had simply prepared, coordinated, and made clear what they would and would not tolerate. And the would-be invader retreated. This sent shockwaves through European capitals, particularly Paris. It meant that France couldn't simply use proxies to regain influence. It meant that military solutions weren't available in the way they used to be. It meant that a young generation of African leaders had learned the rules of the game and were now playing better than the established powers. But the implications ran even deeper. For Burkina Faso specifically, this moment represented something profound, a demonstration of sovereignty. Traore had shown his people and his neighbors that he could stand against some of the world's most powerful militaries, not through strength of arms, but through intelligence, strategy, and alliance building. His legitimacy, which had been questioned after taking power through a coup, became solidified in the eyes of many West Africans who saw him as a leader finally standing up for African interests against external domination. What happened next also validated his strategy of rejecting France and pivoting toward Russia. Within weeks and months following this failed operation, Traoré's government deepened ties with Russia, with China, with Turkey, and with other regional powers that saw in him a leader who wasn't beholden to the old colonial powers. Investment flowed. Partnerships deepened. The narrative of a new, independent Burkina Faso continued to build. The fundamental mistake France made was assuming that Traoré was isolated. They assumed that his rejection of French authority meant he had no other support structure. They assumed that a young military leader in a poor nation wouldn't have the intelligence networks, the strategic vision, or the diplomatic skills to outmaneuver a centuries-old power. They were wrong on all counts. What France failed to understand was that Traoré's Burkina Faso wasn't operating in 1970 anymore. It was operating in 2023, in a multipolar world where information moves at the speed of light, where alliances can be built across borders quickly, and where nations like Russia, China, and Turkey were actively seeking to increase their influence in Africa precisely by helping nations like Burkina Faso resist Western control. The era where France could move pieces around the African chessboard like a grandmaster confident that nobody would challenge them was over. Traoré knew this. He was playing by new rules. France was still playing by old ones. What's also revealing is how quickly France had to retreat from this strategy. After the Chad operation failed, France couldn't simply try again with a different proxy. The failure was too public among regional actors. The alliance between Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali had proven itself real and credible. Any new attempt would likely face the same coordinated response, but this time with the added knowledge that such responses were possible. So France shifted tactics. Instead of military pressure through proxies, they began diplomatic pressure. They began trying to isolate Burkina Faso in regional organizations. They began complications with military aid and support to other nations that might have worked with Traoré. They began trying to make economic life difficult for the government in Ouagadougou. These are the tools of power when military and proxy options have been closed off. But none of these tactics have proven as effective as the old direct control used to be. Because Traoré had already learned that lesson, isolation is less painful than subjugation. This single failed operation also accelerated something that was already happening: the transformation of West Africa's entire geopolitical orientation. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso formed what became known as the Sahel Alliance, a political and military coalition explicitly opposed to French military presence in the region and explicitly oriented toward other international partners. What had started as individual nations rejecting French influence became a coordinated regional movement. And where there's movement, there's momentum. Other nations in West Africa began asking hard questions about their own relationships with France. Countries like Senegal, long considered France's most reliable ally in the region, saw the wind shifting and began to hedge their bets. The implications extended even further. The failure of France's proxy operation demonstrated to other African nations that resistance to external control was possible. It showed that intelligence, preparation, and alliance building could overcome military superiority. It showed that young leaders with nationalist credentials could stand against global superpowers and win. You started seeing reverberations in the Central African Republic, in Guinea, in other nations that had military or civilian governments questioning. But there's a darker side to this story that's worth acknowledging. While Traoré's resistance to external control represents sovereignty and anti-colonialism in their most fundamental forms, it's also worth asking, what happens to a nation when it rejects one power structure without necessarily building an adequate domestic one? Burkina Faso faces serious internal challenges. Terrorism in parts of the country. Economic difficulties. Governance questions. Traoré came to power through coups, not elections. His government has made human rights organizations concerned. The fact that Burkina Faso is no longer under French control doesn't automatically solve these problems. By turning toward Russia and other powers less committed to governance or human rights standards, Traoré has gained military support and international legitimacy among fellow nationalist leaders, but is also potentially trading one form of external influence for another. Russia isn't in Burkina Faso for philanthropic reasons any more than France was. The difference is one of degree and kind. French colonialism, even in its post-colonial form, came with certain expectations about governance and international law. Russian or Chinese partnerships are often more transactional, military support in exchange for strategic positioning, with fewer lectures about democracy or human rights. Is this better or worse for ordinary Burkinabes? That's a genuinely complex question without a clear answer. What's clear is that the age of European domination is ending in West Africa, but what replaces it is still being written. What happened with the failed Chad operation has significance that extends far beyond West Africa. It occurred during a period when the entire global order was shifting. The United States and its European allies were increasingly focused on Ukraine, on containing China, on their own domestic problems. For the first time in decades, some nations in the global south realized that resistance to Western pressure might actually be viable. If a young military leader in Burkina Faso could outmaneuver France, a nuclear-armed permanent UN Security Council member, through intelligence and alliance building, what did that mean for other nations with their own sovereignty concerns? What did it mean for nations that had been pressured to maintain Western-friendly policies? The message sent was clear: the old system of control isn't as ironclad as it appeared. Power flows when nations believe resistance is possible. This is why geopolitical analysts pay such close attention to these stories. They're not just about one military operation or one country. They're about testing the limits of global power structures and discovering that those limits are more negotiable than previously understood. The failed Chad operation marked a genuine turning point in West African geopolitics. Before it, France's decline in the region was a process: slow, gradual, frustrating but manageable. After it, France's decline became a fact that even French officials had to acknowledge. When you can't even get a proxy nation to successfully occupy territory you're trying to control, when you're outmaneuvered by younger leaders playing smarter strategic games, when your military and intelligence advantages can be nullified by good preparation and regional alliances, that's not a setback. That's evidence that the game itself has changed. It's also worth noting what the operation reveals about Traore himself. He's often portrayed in Western media as an unstable military strongman, a coup leader whose hold on power is fragile and whose judgment is questionable. But this operation shows something different: a leader with sophisticated strategic thinking, with the ability to build genuine alliances, with intelligence networks that could compete with France's, and with the political skill to coordinate action with neighboring governments without those actions becoming public knowledge until after the operation failed. Whether you like Traoré's government or not, whether you approve of his methods or his policies, the objective facts suggest a leader who is far more capable and strategic than his Western critics have given him credit for. Looking forward. 39:45. So where does this leave West Africa? Where does it leave France? Where does it leave the global order? For West Africa, it suggests a future where nations have more agency than they did during the Cold War or the immediate post-colonial period. The Sahel alliance between Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali represents a new kind of regional power that European nations can't simply override. This doesn't mean those nations will live in peace or prosperity. Regional instability and terrorism remain serious challenges. But it does mean that their futures will increasingly be determined by their own choices and their own strategic alignments, not by decisions made in Paris or other Western capitals. For France, it suggests a future of declining influence in West Africa. France can still apply pressure. It can use economic tools, diplomatic isolation, and institutional mechanisms. But the direct control that characterized French influence from the colonial period through the Cold War and into the post-Cold War era is definitively over. What remains is negotiation between more equal partners, something France still struggles to accept. For the global order more broadly, it suggests that we're in a genuinely multipolar moment. Nations that were previously marginalized or controlled are realizing that they have options. China offers economic partnerships. Russia offers military support. Turkey, Iran, India, and others offer alternatives to Western-led institutions. The result is that Western nations, particularly in Europe, are losing the automatic deference that characterized the immediate post-Cold War period. The deeper question. 43:00. But perhaps the deepest question this story raises is this: what does sovereignty actually mean in the 21st century? Traoré's Burkina Faso chose to reject French control and build relationships elsewhere. That's sovereignty in its traditional sense, the ability to make your own choices about who you partner with and what policies you pursue. But those choices came with their own constraints and dependencies. True independence is almost impossible in an interconnected world. What Traoré demonstrated is something perhaps more important than absolute independence: the ability to choose your dependencies rather than have them imposed upon you. He chose to be influenced by Russia and China rather than by France. He chose to build alliances with Mali and Niger rather than remain isolated. Those are still constrained choices, but they're choices made by Burkinabes for what they believe serves their interests. The failed Chad operation was significant precisely because it demonstrated that this kind of agency was possible. Against many odds, against powerful enemies, with limited resources, it was possible for a nation to say no and have that no actually mean something. Closing. 46:15. 3 days. That's all it took for Chad's military operation to completely fail without ever really beginning. 3 days to expose France's weakening grip on West Africa. 3 days to demonstrate that a new generation of African leaders wouldn't be controlled or manipulated or used as pieces in global power games. What makes this story particularly significant is what it suggests about the future. If this pattern continues, if nations keep realizing they have options, if they keep building alliances to resist external pressure, if they keep choosing strategic independence over imposed alignment, the world we inherit will be very different from the world that shaped international relations for the past 70 years. The question isn't whether France can regain its lost influence in West Africa. The evidence from the failed Chad operation suggests the answer is no. The real question is what emerges to replace it. Will it be a genuinely multipolar West Africa with nations making their own strategic choices? Or will it be replacement by different forms of external influence and control? For the people of Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and the broader Sahel region, that answer will determine whether their future is truly their own. And that's a question worth paying attention to.